Well, hello there. I want to take the opportunity to welcome you again here to the Ransom Church. My name is Paul, and I get to serve as the campus pastor here at South Campus of the Ransom Church. And I'm privileged to be able to continue on with this series called Double Dare that we have been in here as a church. And throughout this series, we've been looking at these different aspects of our life and really asking ourselves, can we take some steps? Can we improve in some of these areas and maybe look a little bit more like Jesus because of it? And so we've been having a bunch of fun with these different aspects of the series, with the video, with some of the games. And so we've been having fun with it. I hope you have too. But I think we can also admit that it's probably a little bit tough, right? Because I think the Ransom is fairly well known for having challenging sermons that don't necessarily pull any punches. But a series like this can get pretty personal pretty quickly. And so that can make it awkward sometimes. But I want you to remember that it can actually go both ways a little bit, because it can be difficult for some of us to speak on some of the topics we're covering as well. After the first week where Pastor Phil challenged us to get in the game, last week we got to hear from Pastor Jared specifically on the topic of getting in shape. And that was a great message. If you missed that, I can't encourage you enough. Jump on the app or the website and check that out. It was a powerful message, and I think he did a great job of dispelling some different lies that maybe some of us have believed or have been told for a long time. But Jared was a great messenger for that topic specifically, not only because of personal experience in that realm, but also because of a ton of research and study into this subject. He's more than qualified. But next week, we're going to get to hear from Pastor Phil and Pastor Steph, specifically on the topic of marriage. And I'm excited for that. That is going to be a great, great message as well. And while their marriage is not perfect by any means, they have 18 years of hard work and marital success to speak from. But today it's my turn. And I get to speak on the topic of emotional maturity, which naturally begs the question, how in the world is this guy qualified to talk about emotional maturity? And some of you that know me better are really nodding your heads, and I'm offended by that. But Pastor Jared makes perfect sense for his topic, and Phil and Steph make perfect sense for theirs. So what makes me qualified to talk about something as tricky as emotional maturity? And I'm going to tell you what my qualifications are. They're pretty simple. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to load a bus and take off for my 4th consecutive year of summer youth camps. And if you ever want to dive into the deepest, darkest depths of emotional maturity, middle school summer camp is the perfect place to do it. I love my middle schoolers. They know this is true. We're talking about 250 6th, 7th, and 8th grade knuckleheads, 90 plus degrees. They're overstimulated, overcaffeinated, super tired, far from home, hormones all over the place. It is emotional chaos, and I'm supposed to be in charge of these people. So I would say I've seen quite a bit over the last few years, and I think I'm fully qualified to speak on the subject, because whatever emotional maturity is, it is not found at middle school summer camp. I can guarantee you that. And that's actually a good place to start in the first place, because before we can really dive into a double dare sermon on getting emotionally mature, we better be sure we even know what we're aiming for, or even what field we're playing on. Because I don't think anybody would argue about the value of emotional maturity, but if we aren't on the same page about what it truly is, we won't really be able to encourage each other in it. And we definitely won't be able to hold each other accountable in the pursuit of it. So before we get to our central truth and eventually our dare and our action point, I want to start out by simply asking the question, what is emotional maturity? And if you look at some of the more clinical or academic definitions of what emotional maturity is, there's going to be a ton of big words that I probably can't pronounce, but they essentially relate to awareness of and control of your emotions. And so in that more academic context, an emotionally mature person can recognize their own feelings and emotions as they occur and can manage them. Not necessarily remove or reject them, but manage those feelings and emotions in a healthy way. And that is a great, great starting point for what emotional maturity is, as we're going to talk about it today. But as disciples and as followers of Jesus, we need to remember we can never leave out the gospel. No matter what the discussion is, there is no division between the sacred and the secular. Our bodies, our marriages, our finances, our relationships, our emotions, as Pastor Jared taught us last week, those are all rooms in the same house. And all of those different things need to be framed within the gospel, within the life of Jesus Christ. And so I'm going to put forth a working definition of emotional maturity, which forms the basis for what we're going to be talking about today. So here it is. Emotional maturity is the ability to respond appropriately to life in view of God's grace. Emotional maturity is the ability to respond appropriately to life in view of God's grace. A couple quick notes on this definition. First, emotional maturity is an ability. This is not some static thing that you're born with at a certain level and that's that. No, it's something you can learn. It's something you can improve. But it's also something that can suffer with neglect. Emotional maturity is an ability. Second, there's no doubt that responding appropriately to life sounds like a subjective thought. I mean, what does it mean to respond appropriately? But when you add in the concept of God's grace and you begin to look at your reaction to life's challenges through the lens of Scripture and in comparison to the life of Jesus, a standard actually does start to emerge that can reveal our success or our failure to respond well to the things life throws our way. Do your responses, do my responses to what life gives us, do they honor God and point people towards Jesus? Or do they not? That's emotional maturity. And you might think that you're pretty mature in your emotions and that this message may not totally apply to you, but how well do you really respond when life throws stuff at you? I mean, emotionally speaking, how well do you respond when life throws difficult things at you? Like, how well do you respond when you sit down, when you reach over for that toilet paper and the first person before you forgot to refill it? How do you respond in that situation, right? Or how do you respond when you see the perfect parking spot and you go up to it and you realize that the person right next parked just far enough over the line that you can't fit in there and then there's not another spot for miles, right? How do you respond when that happens? Or how do you respond when the job that you really wanted and your family really needed calls to turn you down? How do you respond when your ex-wife or ex-husband starts posting pictures with their new significant other? How do you emotionally respond when your child gets a DUI? When life throws things your way that are not so easy, do your responses, do your emotional responses to those things show trust in God and point others to Jesus? Or do they not? Emotional maturity, or really the lack of emotional maturity, can threaten to take those opportunities and turn them into obstacles. And so with all that in mind, let me say, I double dare you to get emotionally mature. Now, if you've been with us throughout this series, you know that we're structuring these messages around a central truth, a dare, and then a simple action point to start taking some steps in the right direction. And my purpose today is not necessarily to show you exactly how to be emotionally mature. I have some ideas, some concepts, but it's not going to be a 3-step sermon to getting emotionally mature, because each one of us are going to have our own steps that we're going to need to discover and take to get there. But my purpose today is to help us all understand exactly what emotional maturity is, how much it affects our lives, and how important emotional maturity is to our role as followers of Jesus. So first things first, let me start by giving you the central truth that's going to form the basis for today. Here it is. God made you, and God knows you completely. And even though he knows you completely, he loves you unconditionally, and he wants to use you for incredible things. Now, I know that's a little bit long. I don't expect you to memorize it or even necessarily write it down, because a lot of it is fairly intuitive stuff. But what I'm going to ask is that you stick with me a little bit as we go on a little bit of a journey and walk through a few simple truths that I believe are important in the pursuit of emotional maturity. And first, as you can see from our central truth, that journey starts with an understanding and acceptance that God made you. We talked about this a little bit last week with Pastor Jared, but God made you. That's not something that we can gloss over. It's not something that we can take for granted. It's not something that we can any longer assume or take as a given. But it is something that we absolutely need to believe in the pursuit of emotional maturity. Right at the very beginning of the Bible, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27 says, God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And then in verse 31, it says, then God looked over all he had made, and he saw that it was very good. God made you. The same God who spoke the universe into existence made you. And so many of us believe that up here, but rarely let that get here, if ever. God made you, and we see in that Genesis account that he made you, and he said it was very good. And you might say, wow, that's beautiful. God made humanity. That is awesome. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about you. God made you. And he made you the way you are. Psalm 139 is an incredible passage on this topic. I would encourage you to mark that in your Bibles if you want a spot. Psalm 139, starting in verse 13, says, you made all the delicate inner parts of my body and knit me together in my mother's womb. Thank you for making me so wonderfully complex. Your workmanship is marvelous, how well I know it. You watched me as I was being formed in utter seclusion, as I was woven together in the dark of the womb. You saw me before I was born. Every day of my life was recorded in your book. Every moment was laid out before a single day had passed. Yes, God made humanity, but more important than that, he made you. He made you uniquely, fearfully, wonderfully. A few weeks ago, we got to hear from Pastor Josh Wiley on this crazy idea that we are all God's masterpiece. And you might wonder why in the world I'm spending so much time talking about this idea during a message on emotional maturity. And I'll tell you the simple reason. God made you, and you are emotionally unique. You are emotionally unique. That is correct. Your mother was telling you the truth when she said you're a special little snowflake and you're the only you that ever will be. All right? So remember that. But Jared taught us that's true for us physically, but it's also true for us emotionally. You are his masterpiece, and your personality, your emotions and feelings are a huge, huge part of that. In his book called Veneer, the author Timothy Willard spends some time talking about how so much of our culture tries to put us into categories. And honestly, as far as marketing is concerned, as far as the consumer culture is concerned, they want us to become more and more average. Because that consumer culture wants us to all become the same so we can be predictable and malleable and average. But he says this in response, but we are not an average. We are not part of a trend. We are created individuals, unique creatures with our own tastes and preferences, likes and dislikes. We were meant to have a personality. We were not meant to be part of an average. We are absolutely unique. In fact, some of the things that the world tells us are completely universal. Everybody agrees on them. That's not exactly the case. I looked up some random poll numbers to prove this point, and I was even surprised at some of the results, but these were not small polls, mind you, but I found one poll that showed that 26% of respondents said they didn't like puppies. 26% of people out there are monsters that don't love these adorable puppies up there. I couldn't believe it. Another one that was shocking, though, was 10% of respondents in one poll said they didn't like chocolate. Anybody in here willing to admit they're not chocolate fans? There's a couple. Whoa, man, there's quite a few. More than 10%. More for the rest of us, I guess. This one doesn't sound that big, 4%. But when you think about it, 15 million Americans responded that they hated bacon. Bacon, I know. Listen, I wouldn't believe it myself, except my wife is one of them, so I know it's crazy. But in fact, the only poll that I could find that had a unanimous result was one poll that said 100% of people agree that cats are evil. Yep, absolutely. Actually, that might have just been me asking Pastor Phil. But either way, God made us to be unique, and that is a beautiful thing, so don't try to fight it. But as we consider that truth in the conversation of emotional maturity, we need to understand that because we are emotionally unique, you have unique strengths and unique weaknesses. Because God made you emotionally unique, you have unique strengths and weaknesses. Now, we've spent a bunch of time up till now talking about how special each of us are and how God has made us, and he made us on purpose. And if you're a little bit cynical like I am, at this point you might be saying something to the effect of, well, if that's the case, then this creator God out there is either real bad at his job or just plain mean. Because if God did create us and we are unique, we can scroll through Apple News for 5 minutes and get real depressed about the way God made some people. And for some of us, we simply need to look in the mirror to get some of those same feelings. We can look back at our last 10 years or maybe just our last 10 days and think, man, I'm not so sure I like the me God made me to be. Here's the truth. Sin has taken some of your uniqueness and turned it into weakness. Sin has taken some of your emotional uniqueness that God intended for you and created you with and twisted it into emotional weakness. Sometimes it's the sin of others. Maybe for you, it was the sin of a parent who was unfaithful or harsh, and it led to a divorce in your family, and now your emotional uniqueness has been twisted into weakness through a lack of trust and authority. Maybe for you, it was the sin of somebody who had your complete trust, and they abused you. And now your emotional weakness has come through addiction to hide the pain. Maybe it was the sin of a complete stranger you never even knew who drove drunk and took away a friend or family member, and it's turned into bitterness and anger within you. The sin of others can be devastating to us emotionally and take that beautiful uniqueness that God intended for you and twist it into an emotional weakness. But each and every one of us in here can also admit that our own sin has caused this as well. If you look into your own heart and look into your own past, you can see that lust and greed and dishonesty and pride and hatred has taken your emotional uniqueness and twisted it into a weakness as well. Our sin and our propensity to sin have taken our emotional uniqueness and turned it into weakness. The Old Testament prophet Jeremiah reminds us that the human heart is the most deceitful of all things and desperately wicked. Who really knows how bad it is? Jesus himself says in Mark 7, it is what comes from inside that defiles you. For from within, out of a person's heart, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, wickedness, deceit, lustful desires, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. All these vile things come from within. They are what defile you. Listen, our world, our emotions, our hearts are pretty darn broken by sin, and that means we now have challenges to overcome. When it comes to emotional maturity, we have absolute strengths because God gave us gifts and skills and talents and passions, but we have a whole lot of weaknesses too. And we have to understand that because we are unique, created beings, we have unique weaknesses that make emotional maturity a challenge for us. Which leads me to my next point. Knowing and accepting your strengths and weaknesses will help you be emotionally mature. Not just knowing, but knowing and accepting your strengths and your emotional weaknesses will help you be emotionally mature. Timothy Willard again writes this: one of our foundational beliefs as disciples is that we are broken, that we don't have it all together, and that we need Christ. He gives us our identity. If this is true, and if the acceptance of this compelled us to follow Christ, then why do we try so hard to live as if we aren't broken? Let me say it this way. An emotionally mature follower of Jesus knows that they're broken and knows that Jesus is the only fix. We have to know that we're broken and know that Jesus is the only fix. Back to summer youth camps. One of the most fascinating things that I would say I've witnessed as a teens pastor, as a youth pastor, is a summer camp romance. Some of you might have your own stories about summer camp romances. I don't want to hear them. I'm sure they're funny, but I'm a little nervous about them. But as a teens pastor, I can say that emotional immaturity makes these summer camp romances a hilarious train wreck to watch, right? I mean, the first couple days, you see these little relationships pop up all over the place. You know why? Because everyone involved can pretend to be way cooler than they actually are. They can pretend to be way more confident. They can pretend to be way more mature than they actually are. And these relationships start and everything is going great. And then somebody sits at the wrong table during lunch and it all falls apart, right? It's just devastating. Somebody says the wrong thing, looks at the wrong person, tells the wrong joke. And life throws these little insignificant things at them, and the weaknesses start to emerge and throw a wrench in this beautiful relationship that was clearly meant to last forever, right? The summer camp romance is a good example of how our cultural context encourages us to hide our weaknesses, to hide those weaknesses, to put them out of our mind, to not reveal them to anybody else, to pretend they aren't even there, just ignore them completely. But the longer you ignore those emotional weaknesses, the more and more havoc they will wreak in your life. Ian Morgan Crone is an author and a former pastor, and he's an expert on the personality system called the Enneagram. You may have heard of the Enneagram, but the Enneagram is a useful tool in helping people understand more and more about who they are and why they do what they do, but it's primarily based upon understanding what particular fear motivates you the most. And as you dig a little bit deeper into it, you discover this is essentially looking at what weakness is most prevalent in your life. And Crone, in his book, The Road Back to You, would call this our own personal deadly sin. And he writes this: as long as we are unaware of our deadly sin and the way it lurks around unchallenged in our lives, we will remain in bondage to it. The Ransom Church is about setting captives free. And bondage can take as many different forms as there are people because of our emotional uniqueness. But for each and every one of us, ignorance to our weakness is bondage to it. Ignorance to our emotional weaknesses is a one-way ticket to a life of emotional immaturity, because someone who is unaware of or ignores those weaknesses in their life will never be able to respond appropriately in view of God's grace. And the sad truth is that so many of us, even well-intentioned people, are clueless to the weaknesses that are limiting our emotional maturity and, frankly, creating bondage in our lives. So what does it look like to live differently? What does it look like to actually respond appropriately to life in view of God's grace? Well, if we look at the Bible, there's a ton of great examples, but I think the Apostle Paul exemplifies this idea pretty well. In 2 Corinthians, he shares in a letter to the church about a struggle that he is experiencing, and he refers to it as a thorn in the flesh. Some of you may have heard that term before, and while he's talking about this thorn in the flesh, we don't know exactly what it is. There's a lot of theories and guesses about what it could be, but all that really matters is that it's a weakness Paul is facing. And so in 2 Corinthians 12, Paul says this: 3 different times I begged the Lord to take this weakness away. But each time he said, my grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. So now I am glad to boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ can work through me. That's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses and in the insults, hardships, persecutions, and troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. You see, Paul didn't hide his weakness. He didn't deny it. He didn't ignore it. He didn't spend his life unaware of it. He knew it. He accepted it. And in so doing, as an emotionally mature follower of Jesus, he was able to respond appropriately to anything life threw at him in view of God's grace. Did you see that list? Insults, hardships, persecutions, troubles. He faced a lot. Life threw a lot at Paul. If you read the New Testament, most of it was written while he was in prison. Life threw a lot at Paul, and he was able to respond appropriately by pointing people to Jesus. Knowing yourself, knowing your emotional weaknesses can unlock so much more within you, because when you know them, when you accept them, and when you hand them over to Jesus, he can do so much more in and through you. So here's my final point. Knowing and accepting your strengths and weaknesses will help you be emotionally mature, and being emotionally mature will help you follow Jesus better and pursue your calling. Being emotionally mature will absolutely help you follow Jesus, and it will help you pursue your calling, because at the end of the day, it's not about you. You are absolutely unique and special, and you need to get to know yourself and know your unique strengths and weaknesses, but doing so is not about you. Emotional maturity is not about you. Becoming emotionally mature and responding appropriately to life in view of God's grace is not about making your life easier or making your life more fulfilling. Recognizing and managing your own emotions and feelings isn't about what you can gain or what you can achieve, even though your work life, your home life, your social life will all absolutely benefit from emotional maturity. No, becoming an emotionally mature follower of Jesus is all about striding out toward the call God has placed in your life. We've talked for months around the Ransom about finding and fulfilling this call to be disciples who make disciples. And let me say this clearly and unequivocally. Your emotional maturity will either be the lid or the lift to your ability to be a disciple maker. It's just the way it is. If you ignore those weaknesses in your life, and if you fail to respond appropriately to what life throws at you, you're going to have a hard time walking through others that are going through difficult things. If you can't manage your own emotions and capitalize on your unique strengths and weaknesses, you're going to have a hard time building credibility and trust with others that you can pour into spiritually. If you cannot lead yourself well in the area of emotional maturity, it's going to be real difficult to lead somebody else. But if you embrace it, and if you take steps and grow in emotional maturity, your capacity and your ability to make disciples will flourish. Hundreds of you who have stepped out in faith into this journey of discipleship know exactly what I'm talking about. The Ransom's discipleship pathway reveals a huge importance placed on self-understanding. Out of the 10 different categories or modules of discipleship, the modules of prayer, guidance, self-understanding, self-denial, awareness, confession, they all put in sharp focus the need for us to know who we are so that we can follow Jesus better. We need to get to know ourselves. Before we turn it over to the campuses, I want to read one more quote from Timothy Willard in the book Veneer. He writes this: "The God of Abraham leads us into himself. He calls each by name toward himself, the essence of all that is good and holy, full of fear and wonder. This is where he calls you. It's a place where the self decreases and God increases." Or as John the Baptist said in John 3:30, "Jesus must become greater and greater, and I must become less and less." You see, it's not about you. You are God's masterpiece, and his workmanship is marvelous and fearful and wonderful, and that's why it's about him and what he can do through you. God made you, and God knows you completely. And even though he knows you completely, he loves you unconditionally, and he wants to use you for incredible things. We have a calling. We have a purpose in this life. God has unbelievable plans for us, and he wants to use us for incredible things. We get to be part of his world-saving, life-changing mission, and to be at our best, to be at full capacity, ready to respond appropriately to whatever life throws our way, to take our place in the front lines of battle and confidently believe we can fulfill what God has called us to. We need to be emotionally mature.